them. And I'm going to begin by getting them to introduce themselves briefly in a minute to a minute and a half and telling us what they can bring to this discussion, but also their experiences. And my very specific question is, from your own experiences, how do you see the link between climate change and the global economy? And I'd like to begin, and I will introduce the Foreign Affairs Minister of Nepal, Mr. Pradeep Kumar Gyawali, who's come especially for this panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning. Namaste. Of course, there is a very important linkage between the climate change, environment, and the global economy. Let me begin from our own stage and our own perspectives. Nepal, on the one hand, is a big contributor to have a global environment more cooler, because our Himalayas, which covered almost 17% of our land mass, they are contributing a lot to cool down the atmosphere. And our 45% of forest, they are also helping to make the environment more friendly or more safe. However, Nepal is facing disproportionate brunt of climate change, adverse effects of climate change. Our Himalayas are melting down, glaciers are expanding, and they are in the brink of explode. And most challenging thing is in our economy, which is based upon basically in agriculture. The rainy pattern is almost changed, so our indigenous harvesting system has been affected severely. And the day-to-day life of families, especially in the village side, rural areas, and more specifically the life of women has been facing more challenges, because they have to cater the drinking water from the wells, but all the sources of the drinking water are also being level is decreasing. So it has created a big negative effect, and that's why we should focus on the sustainable development, which are more resilient to the adverse effect of the climate changes. We are doing a lot, but the efforts done by the countries like Nepal alone are not sufficient. It requires broader collaboration with the other countries, especially the developed countries and institutions.
The big
well.
polluters, really. The big polluters need to take this issue on board. Well, I'm going to work my way in different ways to keep you all on your toes. So, Paul Ellis, please tell us, what are you going to bring to this discussion? And Paul Ellis is the executive chairman of the company Electron.
Yes, well, I think, so our business is focused on integrating distributed energy resources, DERs, into mainstream energy systems. And it's really a huge challenge. Over the last 20, 30 years, we've seen this explosion driven largely by the falling prices in renewables, an explosion in new energy resources, renewables, attaching to the electricity grid. And that has been fantastic to see. I mean, there are days now when all of the power being generated is from renewables in certain European countries. And that's only going to continue, because we're at that tipping point now where that's just going to go further. The problem that we're facing currently is driven by the fact that integrating these kind of new resources into mainstream electricity systems, energy systems, is really hard, because it was built for a different kind of market. So whereas in the past, let's say 20 years ago in Germany, there was something like 1,000 generators, now there are close to 2 million generation assets in Germany. So actually allowing these kind of assets to play a full role in the system, which is fragmenting in terms of markets, is incredibly challenging. So there are some huge opportunities, and if I can, I'd like to give a couple of simple examples of that, where money could actually be saved now. That is a problem actually accessing this, simply because of the way the markets are set up. So one really interesting example for us is distributed energy resources connected at the distribution level, which effectively are being curtailed off the grid. So you will have, let's say, renewables such as solar or wind. Once that's connected, a decision has to be made whether or not that can be turned off if there's a local constraint on the network. And often the cost of connecting for a firm connection, i.e. without the ability to turn that off, is dramatically larger than a non-firm connection. So not surprisingly, many of these assets, these renewable assets, are being connected to the grid in a non-firm way. In other words, they can be turned off. And the way this is done typically is in a last-in, first-out basis. So you have the most recently manufactured and installed and probably the most efficient renewables are constrained off the grid before the longer term, perhaps a diesel generation unit, which has a contract that may go back sort of 20 years or so, is being constrained off. And clearly that's not good for carbon, and it's certainly not good for the economics of the system. So dealing with problems like this is a very simple way in which we can potentially improve the situation.
And it's ironic that it's not being improved in some respects.
We're trying, but this is, there are contracts in place, existing contracts in place, and that's just one example. There are many, many other examples, and it's not just in the UK we have this. I was in Tokyo recently, and there's a brand new, in Tokyo Gas's office, there's a brand new gas turbine installation that's been put in, and that is actually constrained off before a very old TEPCO power station is being turned off.
So while we're staying with this issue of innovation, and I'm going to keep the women last because we are often the most powerful voices, I'd like to say, in these type of discussions when it comes to bringing about deep change. I would like to bring in Mr. Jean-Pierre Bourguignon from the European Research Council, because now we've heard of probably not even innovations, we have technology at our fingertips. But from your perspective, again, back to this initial question, how linked are climate change and the global economy? And what can be, in a nutshell, because we'll be discussing this throughout our session, what can be done to start mitigating this?
I think there are really two sides, in particular because you want to look at it from the potential financial crisis point of view, which is you get a crisis if you don't anticipate properly. So I think one very key element is to really have enough thought and enough also political action taken a long view, which is to really make sure that you have really properly done the diagnosis, that is you really have identified the consequences, economical and societal consequences. And this requires the mobilization of all kinds of research. The research can be technological, as we have seen. It can be actually implicit in what was described, was also something which has to do with the regulation or with the contract of people signing, which is a different dimension. But also it has to do with mobilizing researchers who really come up with the solutions that nobody thought about. That's why the approach we are taking at the European Research Council of a bottom-up approach, letting totally open the researchers come up with their brightest ideas, is very important. A very good example of this is about batteries. We know that there are many sorts of batteries which are available. They are improving year after year in a very incremental way. But from time to time, you have a totally new type of battery coming up and for which the improvement is massive. Of course, then from something you do in the lab and something which becomes economically viable, you need a big stage, which is the one you mentioned about innovation, which is people in the economic sector seeing this as a possibility and investing enough, and also investing in the right way, which means at the right place and with the right perspective. So I think you need this combination. If you don't take this long view, which mobilizes on the one hand totally new research, but also making sure you have a correct diagnosis of the situation, you can put yourself in a situation of crisis, which then isn't something nobody wants. But it requires really taking this long perspective.
Yeah, okay, so anticipation, this is what it's all about for you, I think, Veronica Scotti. Now, Veronica Scotti is the chairperson and of Public Sector Solutions for Swiss Re. So tell us a little bit about your background and what you're bringing to this discussion and what this anticipation is all about.
Yeah, for us in the insurance sector, and specifically my part of the organization, we're dedicated to partnerships with governments because, as you pointed out, we do believe in the whole stakeholder approach. I really like what Jean-Pierre said, though. I think you really need a long-term vision, but you also need immediate actions. Yeah. So it's very clear. We're seeing and we're living already today the impact of climate change. I can tell you, for instance, statistics in Japan, where we see heavy precipitation has nearly doubled 10 years, these last 10 years versus the prior 10 years. So that's a signal that we are seeing more frequent and more severe events. And if I put it in the context of the financial crisis, you asked us about that, Isabel. Before the last financial crisis, there was a lot more financial flexibility in the world. Structurally, if we look at the makeup of the financial markets, today there is a lot of dominance, if you will, from central banks as a result of a very expansive monetary policy, and the private sector has somewhat limited capabilities. I think we've also seen more restrictions, which I actually think are good because they brought some stability into the financial markets. But that's all to say that we don't have the same flexibility that we had 10 years ago, and what we're facing is mounting risks. And these risks are expressed economically. So if I look at natural catastrophe toll this year, just in 2018, it was $165 billion US. If I look how much of that was covered in the last 2 years, 280 billion were not covered. So that's what we call the protection gap. That is costs that are suffered by families, by companies, by governments, ultimately, because there is not an explicit transfer mechanism. And so what Jean-Pierre said is, to me, fundamental, because we need to understand that there has to be a proactive set of actions that we need to undertake as soon as possible to address these imbalances that we have, but we need to have long-term policies that bring stability to markets so that the capital market can well function, can direct itself, capital can be directed towards the best solutions, and for me, the best solutions are science-informed. So that's how I'd like to take the conversation.
Okay, Daphne Cheng. Now, Daphne Cheng is CEO of Superhuman, and I can say in some respects you started one meal at a time. Now you've gone from one country at a time. So Daphne is taking this problem on, this big problematic on, in the immediate sense now, and changing the way we eat. And that has got a big impact on the environment, hasn't it?
Yes, so my company, Superhuman, is promoting a plant-based and sustainable lifestyle in a way that makes it really easy for consumers to adopt new behaviors, but also we are first and foremost a business, so we're trying to show that there's a business case for sustainability practices, and it's not always going to be a cost or something that can be looked at as, you know, making losses, but actually when you look at the top 10 companies who have added sustainable products to their lines, these product lines, the green lines, are performing better and showing higher profits than their traditional lines. So Target added a sustainable line, and Unilever and Whole Foods. These companies are generating $100 billion in revenue from their sustainable lines alone. So I'm going to flip this question on its head. It's not a financial crisis. It is a financial crisis if we don't do anything. But right now we're looking at a financial opportunity. If we're going to invest in the future, these are major opportunities that businesses can take advantage of.
And just a little question here. We've all heard about the Impossible burgers. So these are burgers that I'm vegetarian. I've never actually tried one, but apparently taste like meat. That doesn't really appeal. But what's your mission impossible, Daphne?
So yeah, I'm just trying to promote a sustainable lifestyle in a way that people feel that they can do it. A lot of people say that following a plant-based lifestyle is too difficult. It's inconvenient. It's unaffordable. But that's not the truth, and so it's always been my mission since age 12 to show that. So I've been trying to promote a more sustainable lifestyle for 18 years, and you know, continue. We're starting to see changes in opinions. And yeah, with the Beyond Meat IPO, record-breaking IPO trading at over 600% its debut price, we're finally seeing a successful business case of plant-based industry. Plant-based meats are growing 42% compared to traditional meat revenue. And so you're really starting to see the business case come out, and hopefully that inspires other companies to really jump on this opportunity. And you know, companies, you know, previously, for example, a supermarket chain in the UK, they estimated that becoming sustainable, adopting sustainable practices would cost them, you know, about 50 million euro. But in actuality, when they analyzed the data 5 years later, they found that actually it added to their bottom line $130 million. So it's just a reframing of your mindset. And if you are a company, a sustainable company, you should be investing into your future. And right now, companies are facing sort of a Kodak moment. You can adapt and change, or you will die. So you can choose to be part of the future. You can choose to make the right decisions, be on the right side of history, and avoid the financial crisis. And, you know, more than that, make it an opportunity.
So Veronica, Kodak moment. So at Swiss Re, and I love that expression, but so how would you adopt that in terms of insurance? Because now we talk about secondary perils. We're not talking about primary perils. The secondary perils are the ones that are causing the most damage. So here we're talking about floods, heat waves, landslides, the secondary effects of natural hazards that we're seeing more and more frequently. But can we afford to insure more? Can people actually insure it? You talked about the figures there, but is it actually possible?
Can we afford not to do it? So I would say that there are a few things in the risk framework. First of all, the risk is going to be there whichever way, you know, whether you insure it or you don't insure it. I think the first and the most important thing, and I believe this is very misunderstood, people think that insurance prices go up because, you know, I don't know, greed and it becomes unaffordable. I think if we don't take actions to actually de-risk the systems, the price can only go up. That is the economically sensible and valuable thing to do. But I think that price is an indicator of the risk. That's my message. So the only way you can take the price down is by actually de-risking. And we can do a lot. I actually do like the positive message. I can tell you that out of the stock of risks that we carry today, 65% can be mitigated away with the right actions. You can adapt. You can change the nature of your infrastructure. You can change the nature of your investments. So there is a lot that we can do. The remainder can actually be transferred. And through that transfer mechanism, through insurance industry to capital markets, what you're doing is you're actually augmenting your financial resilience because you're now sharing that cost with someone. And in the pulley mechanism, there is actually a solidarity mechanism embedded. And then the rest we just have to live with. We're not going to be able to live in a world that is completely without risks. Wasn't the case before. We became aware of climate change and won't be the case going forward. But I think the fundamental is transparency and having a deeper understanding. So you're right, secondary perils have actually not been front of mind for the insurance industry because in years past, they didn't end up in being such big losses. It's what we would have called, you know, those small local losses that diversify away. In reality, nowadays, we're seeing a huge concentration of these losses. They're becoming very, very dominant and very frequent. And I think the monetary aspect is painful in and of itself, but there are a lot of other consequences. It's livelihood, it's food security, it's healthcare. So we have to look at it in totality. And the choice not to take actions, one of which is also becoming more familiar with the reason why there is a cost associated with that risk, whether it's transferred or not, it's, I think, the only non-acceptable answer. So I would really like to see more transparency. We're working very closely, for instance, through the Insurance Development Forum, which is a multi-party platform which involves multilateral development banks, research institutes, the insurance industry. It's not a Swiss Re sole effort. We're an important participant, but I really like the fact that we're doing in partnership with others to develop open source risk models, because it's back to the science. We need to understand the risk. We need to make sure that that is socialized as much as possible so that every stakeholder has the tools to then make better informed decisions.
Now, that sounds all good on paper, but what happens when you're the foreign affairs minister of a country like Nepal, where 25%, according to some of the latest figures, of the people live in extreme poverty? How do they ensure? How does that work out then? I'd actually like you to answer that. What do you feel when someone like Veronica Scotti says, well, the answer's simple, all we need to do is ensure more?
Actually, the access to the climate fund or other financial mechanisms is not so easy and not so friendly for the countries like Nepal. It is not distributed proportionally, and not the whole system and methodology is more sensitive about the requirements of the countries like Nepal. Second, I fully agree with the previous speaker that yes, technology is in the fingertips nowadays, but how affordable is? That is the question. How the developing countries or least developed countries can afford so that they can adapt in their lives to tackle the effects of the climate changes. So the easy access to the climate funds and other financial and insurance mechanisms and the affordable technologies for the sustainable development is very, very important. I would like to add one more point. Nepal can contribute and we wish to contribute in clean energy and environment because we have a lot of hydro resources endowment, we have green forest, but to materialize them, to change them as energy, it requires a lot of investment. So we are trying our best. Even this year, we will plant more than 10 million new trees that will definitely contribute. But what my focus is, the broader collaboration is extremely important to the risk, the urgency, the emergency now we are facing.
And we are facing an emergency. And Jean-Pierre Bourguignon, modelling tools to help us understand those risks when it comes to climate change are at the forefront of this. So can you tell us a little bit about the modelling tools that are available to help us understand the risks? And this kind of ties in with what Veronica Scotti does. And how trustworthy are they?
Well, you see, the difficulty is that first, for the general public, one has to understand that climate change and weather are not the same thing, which is a triviality in some way. But it means that the data you have to collect to really appreciate the climate change are data which have to be gathered over a long period of time, which of course requires effort and really proper organization. So this is the first point. The second point, of course, now, the very important element if you want to have an action is to know what is causing the climate change. And of course, this has been debated and a long effort also organized at the international level. And it's very important that you identify the causes properly. And on this, there have been various attempts of various sorts. And in particular, one thing which we know is playing a very critical role is the role of the forests all around the world. But, you know, there are a number of regions where at this moment forests are really, demolished in a way, in a very systematic way. And now to measure the impact of this on the long term is a very important exercise, and to have to see how it's going to impact globally the world. So this is in these kind of needed efforts which have to be organized, which the efforts have of two nature. One nature is, of course, to collect data, but then from this data to identify patterns and to measure the impact of some things happening in some places in the world. The other part, which is quite different, about modeling, is it's known now the tendency in the world is to get more and more people living in cities. But cities is a very different pattern from the rest. Particularly, I mean, many cities, for example, are living, and people have to survive to traffic jams everywhere. So how do you get this to be reduced? Still, people need to move. They have to move around. So among the modeling that you are suggesting that is needed, part of it has to do with the global world, but part of it has to do also with the local world, in the sense, how do you model a city in a proper way? And from that point of view, I would like to mention a remarkable effort made in Singapore in terms of urban planning, which is to also do urban planning in terms of what kind of building you are constructing in 10, 15, 20, 25 years, knowing the impact on the local climate, quote unquote, of Singapore. And this requires a very sophisticated representation of the city, how it will be transformed by new constructions. And so you see, one has not only to take modeling as a global modeling of the Earth, which is of course very important, but it has to do also with the local exercise of modeling when you do, how do you prepare the next cities. And we know that the cities are going to play a very critical role for the future. Of course, then the other dimension is agriculture, how it can be transformed, and how can you do smart agriculture in a way which is less demanding on resources of nature. And this is, all these dimensions have to be, each one of them has to be taken for what it is, which is a different system in itself.
I'll bring in you, Veronica, but just first, Daphne, the idea of smart agriculture, how does that speak to you?
Yeah, I think that there's more and more technology that's enabling more sustainable agriculture, like hydroponics and or aquaponics, sorry. And I think that more and more technology is also improving the cost of these, implementing these new technologies, and so that over time will reduce the upfront investment, and so it evens out to better profit margins.
And so, Veronica, urban sprawl is a real problem and a real headache, isn't it, not for insurance companies? Now, I know you had something to say there, so
yeah,
what was
I
your
wanted
point?
to build on the point of modeling and maybe also what Pradeep said, because this is a very, very real case. Nepal is exemplary of many other countries that are contributing very little to the issue of climate change, but actually over-proportionally suffering from the consequences
they're experiencing
of
it and not denying it, like
exactly.
some countries.
And you gave the example of Singapore, and Singapore has a de minimis contribution. They're very, very good from an impact perspective, their carbon footprint, but they still invest a lot in new technologies. So, so to the point of models, a couple of things. First of all, I think what is lacking today, and I would just make a global appeal in this sense, is using climate change as a pervasive lens. Whatever economic activity we undertake should be actually assessed using a climate impact lens. And I think if we did that, we would actually make decisions differently.
How many people in the room do that already? When they make decisions, do they take climate change into account and whether they're going to make a kind of climate change positive kind of decision? If anyone could raise their hands. Quite a few of you. Just out of interest, because I'm nosy, how many people are vegetarian or vegan? Not very many.
Not many.
A lot of work to do there. Sorry, Veronica.
So I think that's quite telling, right? We want to be in a position where we're looking at something that is global and systemic in nature. It affects everyone. And so why is it that only some of us are taking those actions? I think it's really, really important. I'll give you an example. I speak on behalf of the financial industry, so I'm sorry if the examples are going in that direction, but it's quite telling. You may be familiar with the Task Force on Climate Risk Disclosure. And that has been a voluntary effort that was launched, and we just got the results only a month ago. And out of 2,000 companies that went through the exercise. And it's a very varied outcome in terms of degrees of understanding of preparedness. But these companies were asked to actually estimate the impact on their business models of a 10-year, 20 years, 30-year scenarios. So this is very important, because when you start thinking 30 years out, you can see, and you realize that you can't come up with all the answers. It goes back to what we were discussing. You start asking yourself deeper questions. And I think I can only encourage us to go into the exercise, not looking just at governments to take decisions, not only looking at
Governments
weather.
aren't taking decisions. That's the problem, isn't it? So we can't really look to that leadership, and that's one of the issues. Where do we look for the leadership?
Exactly.
Here?
So let me take another statistics. There are some very interesting studies from rating agencies. And you know that rating agencies are so important in the financial sector because they determine the credit rating. Today, we don't have climate formally embedded in the rating decisions. And I think that's another fundamental step that needs to, because it has systemic effect, is not related to financial institutions. All companies get rated. Municipalities get rated. I can tell you, we did studies where we know that there are municipalities around the world that will lose their credit rating because of climate inaction. So it goes back to adaptation, it goes back to what kind of technologies do you use, how do you run cities, et cetera, et cetera. But if there are no systematic incentives in the system to make the right choices, those choices may come a little bit later than we wished.
And Paul, yeah, sorry, as you try and kind of democratize energy, do you find that it's an uphill battle? Maybe you have something else to say. So.
I was actually going to jump in on the modeling point and the long-term modeling. And that's something that we have been looking at quite carefully because obviously in terms of justifying our business model, it's incredibly important to us to be able to see what value is capable of being released by flexibility. Now, the energy is something like 48% of all the global carbon emissions, so it's the most important area. And so understanding on a long term what the potential value that can be released by this is critically important. So there is a study that was done in the UK that was done by Imperial College, actually, which predicted something like 40 billion of savings potentially over the next 15 or 20 years that could be released by an appropriate, flexible approach to integrating renewables into the energy system. We're actually in the process of doing a similar study now in conjunction with Imperial College and looking in South Korea at what the situation is there and how much potentially could be released there. But when we look across the world, these studies aren't being done, or very few of them. We certainly haven't come across them. And we think this is incredibly important to be able to justify over a 20 or 30-year period potentially what value is available, and then that will then help direct public policy and so forth towards the investment that's required in order to release those funds.
What is the investment situation, though, when it comes to trying to implement climate change policies? Because we do hear about groups of investors really trying to push for greater green investment. What kind of impact does that have? And I guess this is kind of an open question, because I guess you can all answer to this, so I don't know, well, maybe not Jean-Pierre, okay. But but how do you feel, what's the investment climate like when it comes to promoting this green technology and having the foresight to see that this is going to have a long-term impact?
I'll keep it very brief. What I would say is, I'm going to use a word that Daphne used, it's a tremendous opportunity. So first of all, there is, like I can't express it, the demand is deeply unmet for ESG compliant type of investments.
ESG compliant.
So what I mean is environmental, societal, and so anything that has a positive impact, if you will, and speaks to sustainability. But today we don't have an harmonized definition. We have benchmarks that have developed in the last few years. Many companies try to invest responsibly, if you will. So Swiss Re made a decision already a few years back to switch its entire 130 billion of investments into ESG benchmarked opportunities, bonds, equities, etc. Wouldn't it be wonderful if everyone went there? Because that directs capital to the most important, the most promising, the most aligned type of investments with what we think will give long-term, sustainability to the world. So I think that's definitely, we are definitely doing it ourselves, but I can tell you there is trillions that are waiting by the sideline to be invested that way.
This was exactly my point, because I was just looking, there's 2.4, so the IPCC calculates that it's going to require $2.4 trillion per year over the next 15 years to transform our energy sector. But you're saying there's trillions available. Right. So why are these two worlds not coming together?
It's because the investments are not being presented in a way that are deemed bankable or investable, and it's a very fragmented market at the moment. And if you're a mainstream investor, if you're a pension fund sitting somewhere in Central Europe, it's very difficult to go and invest in Nepal on a good plan, right? That mechanism of connecting supply and demand is not.
This is something you were saying. It's very difficult to access.
Yes,
those
of course. Just I would like to add 2 points. One is we want to transform our transport system, public transport system, in electric vehicles. We replace the fossil fuel-based our transport system to the electric vehicles. But the access to the technology and finance is not so easy for us. Second, I want to one important example I can share. That is, you were talking about the decision-making process, how the people can feel ownership on this decision-making process. We have a very good example of the community forest management that is totally given the authority to the communities. So they discuss, they make plans, and government facilitates. If we can expand such type of examples in other areas, and so that community can feel more ownership on those decision-making process, it will be more sustainable, I think.
And when it comes to, and I'd like to bring Jean-Pierre Bourguignon in here from the European Research Council, if we're talking about low-hanging fruit, the ways we can change our lives quite easily. Now, we've heard from Daphne here, we've heard from Paul Ellis, but in terms of the innovators that you meet, these kind of really young, bright minds, many of whom are here with us in Dalian, what are they saying to you? They're saying that they've got some ideas on their fingertips that will be able to change the paradigm in terms of climate change, but also in terms of kind of financial challenges we're going to have to be meeting very head-on as we look in terms of these investments.
I think you are touching something which actually is not only for this issue, but a number of issues very, very important, which is to really that the public sector invests enough in risk, in really projects which have a reasonably high level of risk. And spontaneously, I mean, public funding tends to be, you want to be sure that you're using the money wisely, but sometimes wisely means you are going to miss the main new change, because in order to really meet the new changes, you need to accept to take some risk. So I think this is something which in terms of public policy is a real serious issue, because of course, since you are getting, using the money of everybody, you have to be accountable for it. But at some point, if you really want to make the difference, you have to also finance some high-risk project. So I think this is something which is quite important in terms of the policy that you put in place, that you're not just looking at things which are sure will produce in 1 or 2 years something immediately feasible, but clearly for all these issues we have been discussing, we know that we have to put enough emphasis, enough also to put sufficiently high priority to disruptive things. And disruptive things will come from projects which have a high level of risk. And the high level of risk, of course, you have to manage it. That is, you have to also, some of them have to produce what they promise. But of course, if you take a high level of risk, some will not produce. So how can you transform public policy in a way which really accepts taking risk? And this is something which we have been trying to do at the level of the European Research Council. One of our motto is high risk, high gain. So which means that we want to encourage the panels who are coming from academic world. And the academic world is not so well known for risk, for liking risk. So you have to take people outside of their comfort zone and that they accept to look at really something they feel, oh, that's a great idea, which can produce something new. And probably some of them will fail. But of course, if you have enough the ones who are winning, it looks like that's what's happening in the portfolio we have. That is, many projects actually are coming up with the real breakthroughs, which of course will make a difference.
And how have you taken on board this notion of risk, Daphne, as you've pushed ahead with your company?
Yeah, so I think, again, it is going to require risk, of course, because we're trying to problem solve and create innovative solutions. And so some things are going to fail and some things are going to take off, but that's also the nature of investment, right? So I think that the opportunity is mostly overlooked because a lot of these innovators and entrepreneurs and founders, their ideas are not really taken seriously, and maybe they don't know how to package it in the right way to present to an investor. And maybe it's such an early stage that they haven't shown traction and they're not generating revenue, but that doesn't mean that their idea and that their ability to execute and build a great company is not there. And so I think there's a major disconnect because it's only very recently, in the very recent years, that you've started to see more interest in investing in sustainable companies. But previously, there was no business case, and so people thought that, you're running a charity, I'm not investing in charities. So that's more of the mindset that used to be there, but now you're starting to see investment interest because there are real business cases. But you're still seeing a disconnect where these better ideas or these more innovative ideas are not being funded and therefore not being implemented as potential solutions to the problems.
Okay, I'd like to actually bring this now out to the floor. So if anybody has any questions, do start mulling over them. And I think we should have some microphones coming around any second now. And I'll probably take a couple of questions at a time and then hand them over to our audience. I don't know if the microphones are there. Or let's begin with this gentleman just on the side who is an easy chap to reach. And then we shall move along. Then we'll go to you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Hubert Lau from Canada, and our company is called TrustBix, and our purpose is to create a world that is more trust, less waste, and rewards sustainable behavior. So everything you're talking about is very exciting to us. One of the questions I have is the actual measurement of benefits. So we're talking about sustainability, we're talking about actions, is how do you measure? Because what we've done is we've created measurements in the cattle industry that has transformed how producers do their business every day and have motivated them to be to implement sustainable practices. So in regards to your fields, I really want to understand the measurements of success and the per pound of benefit that we're creating for the environment. Thank you.
Okay, let's grab another question, maybe from this gentleman over there, and then we'll get you all in.
Yongyang from SOCON industry group, which is a automotive OEMs based in Chongqing. And one great initiative we have is to develop intelligent electric vehicles. And the question I have is, if we believe climate change is related to human behaviors, which some people don't believe, like Donald Trump, right? It seems to me that one of the root cause, fundamental cause, is population growth, right? It's simply because we have more people, and so more resources will be consumed, and more emissions will be generated. And in order to make our world sustainable, and we are willing to ask for individual sacrifice, and we are willing to ask for less economic development from developing countries, right? But it seems to me nobody asked a question to regulate the world population growth. And if we control population growth, a lot of problems could go away. Is that because we are not willing to ask population growth, ask for to regulate population growth? Is that because giving birth is a human dignity, right? Or population growth is a country's sovereignty? I don't know what thought panelists have on this question.
Controversial, and definitely one that will provoke, I think, some interesting discussion. And we'll take one question from the gentleman over here, and then we'll group those together.
Sorry, you've accidentally gotten some diversity. But anyway, thanks very much. It's been a great panel, and I really wanted to, but I'm going to, of course, ask a challenging question aligned with the first one, though I love the second question, and I look forward to that answer. But actually, specifically to Ms. Cheng, when you were talking about these other brands, I love Impossible Burgers, incidentally, but when you're talking about these other brands that are making more money, on their streams. I know in the UK I'm sorry, I didn't say I'm at the University of Bath in the UK. The people who buy organics are seen as price insensitive. And so there's been some confounding of luxury brands and ecological brands. And so is the value that is being seen presently really value that's going into the ecosystem, or is it just a way to deliver quality that's associated with things like careful farming?
Okay, well, let's begin with Daphne, and then we'll open up for the other questions then.
Yeah, thank you. So I think, that the pricing of organic and more sustainable products right now is at a premium, and businesses are of course taking advantage of that. But as demand grows and it becomes more mainstream, you're really starting to see that prices are coming down and becoming more competitive. Impossible Burger and Beyond Burger are both targeting trying to be less expensive than meat, even though currently they are a little bit more expensive. But in order to really make an impact and generate mass adoption, you are going to have to become affordable for the mass population. And so you are starting to see that, but it just, in the beginning stages, as you're starting your company and as they're proving traction, you are going to have your early adopters that are willing to pay the premium, and but then, ultimately, if you want to grow, then the prices will have to come down.
Okay, so then the other two questions. So is it about kind of controlling population growth? Is that really one of the answers out there? And secondly, how do we measure the benefits?
Well, there is one law which is very well known that is, in terms of population growth, I mean, the key factor is the level of education of women. It's a law which has been verified every country in every continent. So if you educate more women, then the population growth will be definitely under control in some way. So I think this is one thing we should not separate everything we have been discussing from education. Because I think when you are talking about sacrifice, it's not something very, very often objective. It's just a measure of the distance between what people expect and what people actually get. And so if education makes people understand that the survival of humans on the planet or depends on these very global factors, then people can accept things in a much more easy way, because it's not seen as a punishment, but just the rule of really running the planet in a proper way. So I think if you can connect this to education in a proper way, which education makes people responsible personally of what's happening globally, I think then you can really deal with the problem in a much more efficient and also sustainable way.
Yeah, absolutely. Also require educating men to allow those women to have an education as well in some countries. But
maybe on the question on the life cycle, I think we had the entrepreneur talk about, how do you demonstrate the total value of a technology. I think it's a very pertinent question. We do need to look at the total life cycle of any technology, of any application, of any industry, so that total cost. And I think more and more of this approach is becoming mainstream. I'll give you an example of something that, again, gives me hope. It's fairly new. It's impact investment. May or may not be related to climate, but there are lots of these examples. And what I like about impact investment, even if it is still really, really minor, is that you're looking at the societal dividends, and you're trying to express the benefit of those societal dividends over time and find way of funding them that isn't just through the public sector, which is, normally facing this decision-making process. Some of it is analytical, some it's political. So I think it's an interesting concept that we could try and incorporate ever more in our investment-making decision. But from it, as a representative of an industry that really has risk-taking at its core, I'll go back to my point. I know it sounds a bit dry about where you allocate your capital, but I really mean it. If the entire industry, which has, I have to look it up, but it's a staggering number, $2 trillion of capacity available, right? $2 trillion US dollars. If we put those 2 trillion into, and I'm not talking investment, I'm talking about our risk-taking ability. If we just put it in things that really align with the climate agenda, I think we could very quickly move the needle in the way certain industries are being rewarded. So as Swiss Re, because it's the company that I know has made these decisions, we decided to do 2 things. Over 10 years ago, we went very bold into renewables, and we will continue to support technology that has a positive impact on the environment. So we were discussing before as we prepared, right? I'd love to learn a little bit more about hydrogen. I'd love to learn a little bit more about carbon capturing and storing, because these are technologies that can make a huge difference in the existing stock of CO2 in the air. And today, we're not seeing enough progress. So they're deemed still risky. We haven't cracked it yet. But I'm really hopeful that if that takes off, and if we can find sufficient support from research, from governments, we should be crowding in investors like Swiss Re to try and back this technology that really can have a tremendous impact on our ecological footprint. Likewise, we also took a decision 2 years ago not to invest in anything that is thermal coal related. And again, it's a very tough decision because this is not unprofitable business. It's just unsustainable. And these are tough decisions to make, but I think I encourage everyone to make choices like Daphne's made. It's all down to the choices that we are willing to live with, and are we trying to maximize the short term versus long term? Paul?
Can I just add something again to the measurement of benefits, which I thought was a very interesting point, and I briefly touched on the situation in terms of flexibility. McKinsey produced a very interesting report, I think 2 or 3 years ago, which looked at abatement costs. So how much would it cost per million tons of CO2 to be removed? And what I found very interesting about that is that there are a number of existing technologies which have negative abatement costs. In other words, these are technologies which, if we implemented fully now, could take out a significant proportion of the CO2 emissions that we're currently generating. And things like home insulation, very boring standard stuff, but that's a big contributor. Waste recycling, right at the other end of the scale, things like LED light bulbs and so forth. So all of these things are things that we can actually, if we account for them properly, we handle depreciation, put the right kind of incentives in place, all of these things could actually be capital value in terms of return on capital that we could be doing already, and we're just not doing enough of that.
Okay. Well, look, we've only got a few minutes to go now, so I think I'm just going to end by asking each of our panels. There is clearly no silver bullet. We're looking at something, if I've understood this discussion correctly, it's going to be very long term. But or their immediate decision, yeah, well, absolutely. Okay, so I correct myself immediately that it doesn't necessarily have to be long term. But if everybody here is to leave with just an idea, if we look at this correlation between climate change and the potential of a financial crisis, what can each of us do at our different levels in society? What can we do to try and implement some sort of change, a value-added change, as you said, an impactful change that can be made easily as we leave? Let me begin with you, Minister.
I would mention 3 major points. Mm-hmm. One is affordable technology, so that they can adapt the new challenges. Second, investment in clean energy, especially. I also agree with you, the previous speakers, that this investment is profitable in long term, not only in the long term, in the short term as well. So investment in clean energy. Third, proper policy and decision-making coordination between the stakeholders, the communities, the governments, the internal institutions, civil societies, and the activists who are very, very active to draw the attention and to the policy feedbacks. So these 3 things are very, very important to start from now. Yeah.
Okay, absolutely. Veronica.
From a business perspective, I really believe companies should all embrace sustainable practices and have a sustainability of their business models. We've been doing this for 20 years, and I think that's part of what has informed a lot of our decisions and will continue to drive us as an organization.
As you look at the business community, are you seeing that change take place?
No, not enough.
No,
not enough. But I think I guess the positive in my message is there are quite a few number of companies out there that do have practices, have adopted them. And I think whether it's regulator or various public agents, they can also push us along, nudge us along to do more and better. So that's number one. The second point for me is around the investment decisions. It is so important that we really make green investing not a separate asset class, but make it really mainstream. If everything could become sustainable in the way we invest, we're actually really accelerating the financial impact, and we would avoid the crisis that you referred to.
Paul Ellis, green investment, or is there more?
Well, I was going to say that the energy industry is a heavily regulated industry, and the consequence of that is things move pretty slowly. And that's pretty unfortunate because that's where the greatest burden of CO2 emissions is originating from. So we have to look now, I think very urgently, at what are the very easy wins within that industry. What could we be doing in that industry that could move things along much faster? That would be the key takeaway.
Okay, and Daphne, you bring us your insight into this.
So personally, at a personal level, a plant-based diet is the best thing you can do for the planet, and it's not that difficult. It just takes a little bit of education, and that is what my company is trying to move forward and make easier and better and tastier for everybody. But at a business level, also just really thinking more creatively about solutions. For example, I think he's here actually. An artist created this smog tower that creates diamonds out of CO2. That's an amazing business opportunity right there. You're literally creating diamonds out of thin air. That's money out of thin air. So why isn't somebody going and investing into that, scaling that out, and building $1 trillion business? I don't know. But looking at these creative ideas is where you're going to find the solutions, and paying attention to the people who are creating these ideas, but they don't necessarily have the resources or the capital or the know-how or the full team put together to fully make it work and scale and become normal.
Jean-Pierre Bourguignon from the Euronews.
Well, very quickly, I think never think that it's the fault of the others. You should always think that you have your own responsibility and make enough room to think out of the box, because I think it's extremely important to know that business as usual is certainly not anymore a possibility.
Yep, no longer business as usual. Well, I think this has been an absolutely fantastic panel, and I've really enjoyed listening to our different speakers here who've brought so much to this discussion. And we are going to wrap up because we've got 10 seconds left, so that gives us 10 seconds to give them a very big round of applause. Thank you very much.